You're listening to episode 96 of Liz's Healthy Table.
Looking for a healthy new way to feed your family without the hassle and hype? Welcome to Liz's Healthy Table, where your host, registered dietitian nutritionist Liz Weiss, serves up fresh and flavorful recipes with a tasty side of science, good nutrition, and fun. Are you and your family ready for some wholesome food that tastes great too? Don't change that dial. Your food adventure starts here.
Welcome to the podcast, everyone. We have been living with the pandemic for more than a year, which is hard to believe, right? I don't know about you, but in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, I was in a panic. I'll admit it, especially when it came to leaving my house and going to the grocery store. There was a lot of confusion and concern, kind of the orders of the day. And, we wiped down groceries, going to a restaurant, let alone getting takeout. It was, for me at least, out of the question. And then there were those news headlines. They featured stories about meat packing plants and employee safety. So, we were worried about what was happening inside those plants. Well, my guest today is Dr. Ben Chapman, Ph.D. He is here with the latest on food safety and COVID. He's going to be answering my most pressing questions and yours. And I guarantee you will learn new things about this virus, and you'll feel more comfortable and prepared the next time you make a trip to the grocery store or you get takeout. Ben Chapman is a professor and food safety extension specialist at North Carolina State University. He studies pathogens and public health with the goal of less foodborne illness. He has a BS in molecular biology and genetics, better him than me, and a master's and a PhD in plant agriculture. His team at North Carolina State is involved in a really cool project called FoodCoVNET, which provides evidence-based information designed to alleviate all of our fears about the food supply and to provide important information on how to stop community spread of the virus. So we're going to talk a little bit about that resource on the show, because you're definitely going to want to check it out. And of course, I will share a link in the show notes. Okay, a few friendly reminders. If you love the show, tell a friend about it or post a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on lizshealthytable.com and be sure to check out the show notes from today's show for all of the resources discussed. And obviously, I'll give you links to Ben on social media and on the World Wide Web. And of course, follow me on Instagram at Liz Weiss. Okay, let me bring Ben Chapman into the conversation. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Liz. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for sitting through that intro. I appreciate it.
No problem at all.
So before we get into the nitty gritty about COVID and food safety, why don't you just tell everybody a little bit about yourself? I mentioned you're at North Carolina State University. So just tell us, where you live. I know you have a couple of kiddos. We have a lot of families who listen to the show. So just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I've lived here for the last, 13 years. I've been a professor at NC State University for that long. I'm originally from Canada. I came to NC State for this fantastic opportunity and job, but I'm from Toronto originally, and so I've had the benefit of living in a couple of very similar countries, but not exactly the same. I've got a couple of kids that are 10 and 12, and my wife does home design work. So over the last year or so, we've all been here in the house doing virtual school and food safety things. And she actually does a lot of work where people send her pictures, and she does design online. So it's all been a weird year of everybody here, but it's all worked out.
Now, is she doing design or decorating?
So both design and decorating.
Oh, I need her.
Yeah. So, but yeah, so we live here in the great city of Raleigh, and it's a fun place to raise a couple of kids. The food scene is awesome, and that's one of the things that I've learned over my career in food safety. I get asked about new techniques and new technologies. And so I'm really lucky to live in a city where I can get into the culinary world and see a lot of things sort of cutting edge happening and work with a lot of chefs and restaurant owners and businesses on food safety things.
Yeah. So, this is totally off topic, but if I were to come to Raleigh and you say, oh, you've got it, the food scene's super hot here. What's kind of the vibe? Is it farm to table? What's happening in Raleigh?
So it's really like modern Southern food.
Oh, I like that.
It's really, I don't know if that's how I describe it. I'm not sure if that's how the culinary world would describe it, but it's kind of like traditional North Carolina foods featured. Certainly we're very close to the world of agriculture here. And my position's in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, but our culinary world is really over the last 10 years grown in really connecting the eastern and western parts of North Carolina communities in Raleigh. So we've been really lucky to have some James Beard Award winners and nominees and lots of like great cuisine from sort of traditional barbecue, fried chicken, but moving forward to just like Asian and Southern food fusion. So it's
interesting.
Yeah, it's really exciting place. And it's kind of like moving to Raleigh. When someone told me you're going to find the best restaurants like in strip malls that are not in downtown, like it's crazy. And that's exactly the case. Like it is, the city's kind of grown up around this food scene in different areas. So it's not all in the downtown core. So it's really accessible to lots of different communities.
Yeah, very cool. Well, I'm determined to love okra one day. So I'm working on that. And I know if I came down to Raleigh, I'm sure I'd find some good okra. And I'm sure you appreciate the warm weather down there. The coldest weather I've ever been in, by the way, was in Toronto. And I'm like, oh, I'm from New England. I can handle cold weather. Oh my gosh. In my life, I think it was like, 25 below and then windy on top of it. Like crazy.
It's exactly why I live in North Carolina. And we are entering pollen season, which is a very different experience than growing up in Canada, where right now there is like a thick haze of yellow from all the pine trees. Just like, as I look at my window right now, I can see this. We have a basset hound who's got really long ears. He'll drag his ears along our back deck and come inside just covered in pollen. So anyway, that's the season we're in right now, but it is beautiful.
Yeah, you got to hose them down. Okay, so let's talk about what you do. So you are a professor and food safety extension specialist at North Carolina State University. What does that mean to be a professor and food safety extension specialist? What do you do?
Well, my days are really varied. So from the professor side of things, I do research in the area of really a lot of different things in food safety. Primarily, it's in the areas of consumer food handling, as well as restaurant, grocery store, farmers market, food pantries, school food safety, those types of areas. I don't do a lot of work in the area of food manufacturing or processing or on farms. I have a lot of colleagues who work in that area, but my niche is really what happens to food in the distribution chain. So I've been we're actually in the midst of a project right now looking at pathogen control and distribution centers for grocery stores and restaurant distributions. But more, I guess, exciting or closer to probably where your listeners are at, I've done a lot of work looking at how people prepare food from a food safety standpoint. So we actually built kitchens here at NC State to bring in just regular everyday people who fit the profile of the types of studies we want to do. So for instance, we looked at a project a couple of years ago around washing poultry. And so we recruited people from the community who self-declared that they wash poultry before preparation. And what we wanted to know was, what does that actually mean from a food safety standpoint? So we know that there are recommendations around it's a problem for food safety that it may spread pathogens around a kitchen. Up to that point, there wasn't a lot of data on that. And so we brought people into these kitchens, asked them to prepare food like they would at home. We have video cameras all over the place. We had surrogate bacteria that was on the chicken. So when someone actually washed it. We were able to swab and sort of figure out in the environment where it went. And all that information was funded actually by U.S. Department of Agriculture, but it's used to develop better messages for consumer food safety. So that's like my research is really in that area, is really understanding what do people do and what does it mean from a risk standpoint.
So my obvious follow-up question is, should we wash our chicken? Personally, I don't, but should we wash our chicken? Or when you rinse and wash it before you prepare it, does that spread pathogens around your kitchen?
So here's it's such a great question. I'll answer it the way that, I do a lot of risk communication, and I'm not in the business of telling people what to do, but I can tell you about the risks associated with it. And certainly washing meat, poultry is only going to increase risk of foodborne illness. It's not going to decrease risk. And what we found in our study was that the pathogens don't spread all throughout my kitchen. It's not like this plume of bacteria that goes all over the place. But what does happen is it really leads to contamination in the sink. And the problem with that is we do a lot of other things in our sinks. We may rinse leafy greens, for instance, in a colander, and the splashing from that sink basin when we have rushing water can end up driving pathogens up into the leafy greens. And in fact, that's exactly what we found in our study. About 25% of the time when people wash their poultry and prepared a salad afterwards, we found the surrogates in the salad. So I don't want to say you shouldn't do it, but if you do it, really clean and sanitize and pay attention to where those splashes might go. And that knowing that there's going to be pathogens on your hands as well.
Right.
And
you're not points,
Yeah. And you're not doing anything to really reduce risk. That's why we cook poultry. So,
right.
Yeah.
If you're going to cook it, then why rinse it ahead of time, which is, totally unrelated to COVID. But, if you look at things like salmonella, which could live on chicken, then that's a bacteria. COVID is a virus. And so we're going to get into that and talk about that today, because there's just so many questions. People are still really concerned about it as it relates to food. Let me transition then into my next question. Before we actually talk about COVID, that nasty virus, COVID, you are a podcaster, and I just want you to give your podcast a shout out so people who are listening to my show can check out your show.
Awesome. Yeah. So I actually do co-host two podcasts, one called Food Safety Talk that I've been doing with a colleague of mine who's another microbiologist from Rutgers University. His name's Don Schaffner. Don and I, for the last 7 or 8 years, we've done a bi-weekly podcast that's sort of, long form like this, where we just talk about what's going on in the world of food safety and things that we're doing. And then about a year ago, we started a second podcast called Risky or Not, where people who listen to our other podcasts are like, okay, great. You guys kind of pontificate a lot about this stuff. And really the answer to every food safety question is it's complicated and it depends. I need to know, if I leave my milk in my car overnight, is that a problem? And so we started a whole other podcast to answer those very specific questions in a short way. So you can check those two podcasts out. But yeah, it's the world of podcasting is something that 6 or 7 years ago I didn't realize how big of a media it would become. And it's like this. You get to meet and talk about meet different people and talk about very specific topics. And it's a niche, right? Like there's, if someone wants to find a podcast on, can I, eat undercooked eggs, then we've got an episode on that. Like it's out there. There's stuff out there on that.
I will eat undercooked eggs, but I will not eat undercooked chicken. We will leave it at that.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay. So as part of your job, I know you're involved in this website. It's called FoodCoVNET. I'll give a link in the show notes. I want you to tell everybody about this website because it's really like a wealth of information. There's so much confusion, and we're going to get to a bunch of questions in a couple minutes, but there's so much confusion about COVID and food safety. This is like a one-stop shop where people can go. So tell us about that website.
Yeah. So really back in March of 2020, because of what I do in the world of food safety, I was getting a lot of questions from food industry folks, from consumers about this big question, right? That we've kind of like danced around a little bit here, which is, can you get COVID through food? And if so, what do we do about it? And if not, why not? And so I started to pull together experts in the area of food safety and virologists to answer really food specific questions, because a lot of the material that was coming out a year ago was like, okay, what do I do when I go to the grocery store, or should we shut gyms, or like it was more general. It wasn't just about food settings. And so we started this project called FoodCoVNET, and a website at foodcov.net, which you'll link to. But the whole idea was to exactly as you said, provide a one-stop shop for people all throughout the food supply chain, whether it was someone on a farm or a consumer who goes into a grocery store. What are the things that I need to worry about? What are the things that I don't need to worry about? What are people doing to keep me safe? And really to help understand the science around that. Since then, we've been really lucky. We've received funding from the federal government to not only continue to develop a lot of material about this, but actually go into the laboratory and fill data gaps about how long might the virus survive on a takeout container, for instance, or a grocery cart handle, and what's the likelihood that it could be transferred. And so a lot of the material that we that we'll talk about today is based on our best available science, but we still have to develop some more of that. So this is a big part of what I do right now is really trying to better understand this intersection between food and SARS-CoV-2 and COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and like you said, it's evolving, right? I know, Ben and I were at a conference together, just so everybody knows, I was at a conference called VINE, VINE, and Ben was one of the speakers, and I was like so intrigued. And then a few of us invited him to Clubhouse to do a food safety chat. And then I thought, hey, why don't I have him on the podcast? Because there's a lot of questions out there, which leads me to a question about transmission. So I would like to talk about, sounds gross, mucus and spit, and how COVID, give us the big picture, how is it spread? Because, we're going to get into some questions about takeout and grocery shopping and the cart handle and all that. But what's the hot spot? Really, how is this thing spread? Which leads me to the spit question.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you're alluding to it perfectly. How it spread is really these virus particles in mucus and spit that when we talk, if we're doing karaoke, if we're yelling, we're projecting these very tiny little droplets of mucus that contain lots and lots of virus particles that can float in the air a little bit. Not like, like the pollen I'm seeing outside of my window sort of floating off in a haze, but they can carry, feet and multiple feet and sometimes can sit in the air for a while. And there's like a whole bunch of stuff with HVAC systems and air currents that we're learning about because of this. But really the transmission route is inhaling those virus particles that are in that mucus that's floating in the air that's always been there, right? Like, I mean, this is not a new like COVID aerosol thing. It's how we get influenza and rhinovirus, the common cold. It's very much the same process. But that's really the transmission. This idea of like person to person is why social and physical distancing are so important. It's why face coverings are so important from a public health standpoint, because they catch that mucus that's coming out and that won't make it to an aerosol. And then the further we are apart, the less likely that those virus particles are going to travel to that other person. But that's really the route, is just inhaling shared air. It's probably the best way that I've heard it described, which is different from the world of food safety. You mentioned, spit and mucus being gross. I'm constantly in the world of like poop and vomit. So that's how bacteria and viruses that are foodborne get moved around. Now we're talking about a respiratory disease. It's certainly another, bodily function that's gross, but it's different. It's not the same. How we get norovirus is not how we get COVID. And that's kind of a challenge for us to sort of explain that, what the things that people are commonly exposed to in the world of food it's transmitted in a totally different way. And so that's, that's kind of where we're at.
So let's talk about like norovirus or salmonella. People would say, oh, I went to a restaurant, I ate something, I got salmonella. How does that differ from COVID? You just said they're transmitted in a different way. Is one through the lungs and one is through the GI tract?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. The way that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, infects you is that as you breathe in this shared air, the infection ends up drawing into the lungs, the respiratory system. What we know about sort of the medical aspect of this, of the infection, is that there are certain receptors on cells that allow for this virus to infect. And many of our cells have it, but there are more of those receptors in the respiratory system. And so the people that get sick, I mean, and like with COVID, it's not so much just like an infection, but where we see these serious consequences, hospitalization, symptoms, those are infection sites are in the respiratory system, where things like norovirus and salmonella, the infection actually happens in the gut, in the GI tract, in the intestines, largely, so that virus or bacteria can move through the system. And those foodborne pathogens are built for that. They can survive in the gut to lead to infection, where this respiratory virus that causes COVID isn't. It's not very stable in high acid environments, and it just doesn't hit the same amount of the same type of cells through that GI tract. Now, it's not to say that we haven't seen, to get into my favorite topics of poop and vomit, there have been a couple of studies over the last year showing SARS-CoV-2 in stool samples. But the likely explanation is it wasn't transmission through the gut. It was infection in the respiratory system and then moves to different parts of the body through our circulatory system, which is a really, like, I know it's kind of nerdy, but it matters because the infection route not being through food. And again, like, we're a year into this, but millions and millions of cases, zero clusters linked to food. That's really kind of important for us in the world of food. But we certainly see food settings being an issue. Being around other people in grocery stores, being around other people at a holiday dinner at Thanksgiving. We know that there are tons of clusters that happen. Recently, there was a report that CDC put out about a bar opening at a college town in Illinois, leading to like over 150 illnesses. And it's those, like, there's food and drinks being served there. People are removing their masks. They're not practicing social distancing. So it's happening in foods. It can happen in food settings, but it's not a food thing, right? Which makes it different.
Sure. That makes perfect sense. What about the common cold? And then we're going to get into some specific questions from listeners, but you talked about salmonella, foodborne illness. You talked about coronavirus, COVID-2, that's a virus. What about the common cold? How do we get that?
So it's funny, like, viruses are probably the thing that I'm most, as a public health person, the thing that I'm most amazed by. So we think about like viruses as a class, right? Like, there's a whole bunch of different ones. We don't often understand from a public standpoint what the differences are, but there is a difference between respiratory diseases like the common cold, which is a rhinovirus largely. There are some common cold coronaviruses as well, or influenza, that because of the structure of the virus, because of the biology, I think where we're at right now is that aerosols are important in coronavirus, influenza, common cold. They are more high-touch surfaces, fomites, what we call them in the world of public health, where like a grocery cart handle, are probably more important in the common cold, where someone can touch it, pick it up, and introduce it into their system than we're seeing with COVID. So I would say that I know your question's about food. None of these things do we have any demonstration that those respiratory viruses end up in food and then cause infection through food consumption. So we kind of like put the rhinovirus, the common cold, influenza, and coronavirus into this class of like, these are respiratory transmission diseases. They cause respiratory illnesses, where something like norovirus causes gastrointestinal illness, and it's transmitted through the gastrointestinal tract, which is where food goes. So it's kind of this like what's been exciting from a microbiology standpoint is that we're learning more and more about lots of different respiratory viruses as we understand more about COVID-19, but we certainly don't see the common cold, influenza being foodborne at all.
Okay. We'll get a little more into that because I do have one question about that from a listener. Well, let's start with a question from Amy. Amy says, well, right here, if you can catch a virus like the common cold from touching a germy shopping cart at the grocery store, why can't you catch COVID by touching something?
So the quick answer is we don't really know yet why. What we look at in the world of public health is studying the epidemiology of transmission, the idea of where are illnesses coming from, what are the risk factors associated with that. And we see from a common cold standpoint with, years and years of research that high touch surfaces are more likely to be a course of transmission. That's why hand washing is so important. And it's kind of the hard part about the world of science. A year seems like a long time, but we've been studying salmonella for 70 years. We've been studying E. coli really intensely for 40 years. We're now just looking at a year's worth of data on SARS-CoV-2. And we don't have all the answers. Some of it's going to have to do with the types of structure of the virus, on why it's more likely to be transmitted through aerosols than on surfaces. Some of it's going to have to do with the types of proteins that are on the outside of it. Some likely are going to. Some of this will get explained through how much virus gets put out there and how long does it persist on those surfaces. And so each of these viruses have different physical and genetic makeups. And that really gives us an indication on why there are different transmission routes. So the question from Amy, I think it was, I would say that when it comes to the common cold, shared air is very much still something that we need to worry about, this idea of aerosols. But for whatever reason that we don't know yet, the virus that causes the common cold survives, persists, transfers better from high touch surfaces than coronavirus does. And so we know that, we just don't know, we don't know exactly why yet. And yeah, that's kind of the process of science.
So when we go into the grocery store and they're wiping down these handles and we're Purelling like crazy, that's really going to be much more helpful in reducing our risk of getting the common cold down the road versus getting COVID down the road. But when we're at the grocery store wearing a mask, practicing social distancing, they have the arrows, going through the grocery store, that's going to help reduce the risk of getting the common cold, but more importantly, getting COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing, Liz, I'd add is that the practices that we've seen really increase over the last year around hand washing and cleaning and disinfection probably pays off a lot for us in my other world of foodborne illness and norovirus, where it's something that we hadn't been doing. And norovirus, we see about in the US 20, 30 million cases a year. Much of it is foodborne. Some of it's person to person, but we've seen there was some data that was released in the fall where CDC looked at norovirus from March last year through September compared to previous years. And our numbers of norovirus just dropped drastically. And it's probably because way more hand washing, it's paying attention to these high touch surfaces. So it pays off in other pathogens as well. And when it comes to norovirus, the shared air isn't really so much of an issue unless you're around someone who's vomiting, which that's, nasty. That's kind of the thing that we're all learning as we look around this. What are the other ripple effects of what we've done over the last year as it relates to this pandemic in other pathogen areas?
Yeah, I have not had a cold since the whole pandemic thing started. So February of 2020, I haven't had anything. So knock on wood, I don't have any wood, but I will be knocking on some wood in a moment. I see some, I'm going to knock on it. Okay, there we go. So I have a question relating to this, and that is, are we over sanitizing? Because, a couple of years ago, we kept hearing about don't use these antibacterial soaps. We want to be exposed to some bacteria in our world. I mean, I know playing out in the dirt and gardening is really good for the microbiome. There's a lot of microbes out there. People get out in the dirt and play. But are we putting ourselves, is there an unintended consequence from all of this hyper sanitation?
Yeah, so I would say no, and it's a risk trade-off, right? For me, I'm in the world of public health pathogens. What I'm, in the intro you mentioned, my goal and my program's goal is having less people get sick, and from foodborne illness and from pathogens around food. And so having, whether it's antibacterial soap or hand sanitizer, just, common hand washing, these are all ways that we reduce the likelihood of moving those pathogens around, whether it's COVID or, SARS-CoV-2 or otherwise. The thing, and this is like the dirty little secret of being a microbiologist, is everything I look at on my desk is covered in bacteria, and mold spores and yeast. I mean, that's the world that we live in. We are but hosts on a microbiological planet, and our, but these aren't pathogens. These are bacteria that are colonizing my mouse and my keyboard and my phone, because that's the environment that they live in. So even if I clean and sanitize my, all the things that I touch in my kitchen, whatever it is, my phone, maybe 4 or 5 hours later, there's bacteria that's back there growing. So we're not eliminating that exposure to bacteria ever in anything that we do. What we're really trying to do in cleaning and sanitizing antibacterial soap, hand sanitizer, is get rid of the pathogens that are transient, that are in and out of our system, that aren't residents in the environment that we live in. So there's certainly been a lot of conversation about getting rid of exposure to this and what that can do to our immune system. But I would say that being a microbiologist, you are always priming your immune system from all this bacteria that's here all the time.
Mm-hmm. And I guess one of the positives or the silver linings from COVID is a lot of us have gotten outside more. I know, Ben, you were just telling me you and your family went on a vacation in Tennessee. You were mountain biking, you're out in the forest. So getting outside is so important, right? Because then we get exposed to all the good bacteria.
Absolutely.
Well, now Amy has a few questions. So we're going to finish Amy's questions and then we'll move on to a couple of more. So she says, if a waitress or kitchen staff coughs on your food or hands you your plate, can you catch COVID that way?
So the quick answer is no, but I want to give a little nuance to that, because if a server is a carrier of SARS-CoV-2 and they cough on their hands or directly on their plate, which is not a food safety thing that we would want to have for lots of other reasons, if that happens, the virus particles could be placed onto, the utensils, could be placed onto the food. But the likelihood of transmission, we haven't seen it be possible. And let me walk you through why. So the virus particle gets placed there. It immediately starts to dry out because it needs to be in that moisture droplet. And very fine droplets have a lot of surface area, so they evaporate. And so the virus particle starts to, almost immediately starts to lose its ability to persist, starts to break apart. So it breaks apart more over time. This is why sort of we think about food packaging that comes from a meat and poultry plant or a food manufacturing plant that has people that have cases that over time, the virus just doesn't want to be in that environment. It wants to be inside of a person. But so that's one step here. Then the virus has to get from your food to your respiratory system, or from that plate or from that utensil to your respiratory system. And there's not a lot of really good routes to do that, because when we eat, our food doesn't go into our respiratory system. Certainly it goes to the entrance. We're breathing through our mouth, and that's where food goes, but our food goes into our esophagus. And so if it's there, it will, And again, I don't want to talk in absolutes because these are 1 in a billion, 1 in 10 billion, 1 in 100 billion chance of that virus particle ending up in your respiratory system. And then it still needs to infect. And then it needs to like overcome your immune system. So there's like a lot of like steps, and we're like think of it as like a lot of hurdles in the race for this virus. And at this point, with tens of millions of illnesses, are really high focus on where clusters are coming from. In the public health world, we would have expected to see a bunch of people going to the same restaurant at different times, a server who was sick, didn't know it, they were asymptomatic, leading to clusters of illnesses. And we haven't seen it. We have no examples. And I say that in a very, like, with a very keen eye, that literally that's what our project every day is looking for. We scour the internet and work with public health partners to be like, have we missed something? Are there clusters that are associated with food? Are there clusters associated with restaurants? That food was a transmission source, and we don't have any examples of it. And so it's, the absence of the example doesn't prove it. But when we look at sort of the body of science, all the hurdles that it needs to go through, it's such a unlikely process. And the more likely process is someone was in shared air with someone else.
Right. So if the waiter was standing over you for a long time without a mask on and you have no mask on and you're all chatting away, there goes that airborne situation.
Absolutely.
But that plate of food where a particle dropped on it starts to break apart and then you're eating it. It's not going to happen.
Absolutely.
Or you haven't seen it. You haven't seen it.
And it's such a low chance that just walking into a setting with other people is a much higher chance of getting sick.
So the same can be said then if you are going to get takeout, or you hired somebody, let's say they work for Instacart or one of those, and they're shopping for you and they're touching all your food, and that gets delivered, right? So you've got this basket of food, whether you picked it up yourself at the supermarket, you're shopping, or whether you hired someone and maybe they are a carrier, and all those groceries come into your house. Again, are we going to have to frantically wipe everything down? Because you early on in COVID, I mean, right. I wouldn't even let my husband don't bring the groceries in the house. Like they were outside and we'd wipe them down and bring them in one at a time. And it was just so scary. So you're saying we can bring the groceries in and we're cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll throw my normal food safety hat on for this. After I handle packaging or food that anybody else has handled, hand washing is a step that I want to be practicing anyway. And it's not for SARS-CoV-2 reasons. It's for norovirus and salmonella and E. coli, because all of those same things that you talked about could be a transmission route for foodborne illness, and way more likely. So after but I'm not, and I think about this, it's not, I wasn't leaving my food out on my porch beforehand because of norovirus reasons. I wasn't spraying my packaging down with Lysol. I'm washing my hands when I'm doing food preparation. Over time, the risk of that transmission route goes down because, bacteria dry out and viruses won't persist as much. But, that theater of over sanitizing, that I don't look back at that and say, oh man, we were so silly we were so silly to do that. I think when we're looking with an emerging pathogen, we just don't know, right? So we gotta, what are the things, what are all the things that I can do? And are they doing something? Maybe, maybe not. And now as we learn over this short amount of time that we weren't really doing much in that, then no, we don't really need to do that. Just, wash your hands with just normal soap and water. Just like you would in a normal setting when it comes to food preparation. That's going to reduce the risk as much, if not more, than all those other steps of spraying down and leaving things outside.
Yeah, just wash your hands. And with produce, you certainly want to wash it. I always wash it and scrub it, not with soap and water, but just with water and scrub I have a little scrub brush. But yeah, interesting. And it's over time, it's been over a year. So as I think about, I grocery shop every week and I don't wipe anything down anymore, but that took me a year to get comfortable with that. But yeah, it's the hand washing. And certainly if you have raw meat and it's packaged in something, I always have that in an extra wrapper of some sort, so nothing drips out. So that's, that's the step that we always did. Okay. A couple more questions. This is so good. Thank you so much for all of this. So we always hear about bacteria like salmonella and the importance of storing food properly, cooking it to the proper temperature. Does COVID-19 behave like salmonella and other food pathogens? Well, I think we've covered that. This is from another listener. So just again, COVID-19 behaves very differently from salmonella and other food pathogens.
Yeah.
The entryway into the body is so different.
Right. And that's to our benefit. One thing that I will say on this is that it's also not very heat stable. So heating up food, if the virus is there, is certainly going to get rid of it even more. But again, like we talked about before, it's just not a likely transmission route. So it's kind of like it behaves unlike all those other things. And that's a good thing for us when it comes to food.
Absolutely. You talked about hygiene theater, right? And, when you go into a store, a restaurant, a grocery store, wherever, there's all this sanitizing going on and everybody's wiping everything down. I actually went into, TJ Maxx the other day. They couldn't have been nicer. So many employees there, and they were, you walked in and they have the Purell and they're wiping everything down, and it's like a whole thing, right? It is. And you feel very safe, and everybody's wearing a mask. It's Massachusetts and they do have a mask mandate. So I'm definitely not catching the common cold from being at the TJ Maxx. But do they need to continue doing this? Is this theater, or is this something like in public spaces that maybe you think we're going to continue doing moving forward? Yeah.
So here's kind of like, the social science aspect of what I do in the world of food safety and public health. The risk reduction step that we like, if we were just purely like try to calculate what kind of risk reduction am I getting from everything that you're talking about with cleaning and sanitizing, disinfection and deep cleans. CDC recently released some updated guidance that is in step with where the science has been on this for the last years. It's probably not doing a lot from if the pathogen's here, I'm reducing risk. But there's another function of it that I think is maybe overlooked a little bit when we talk about just hygiene theater versus not. And it's telling you and telling me that we're still in the midst of a pandemic, right? It's still important that we're wearing masks, that we're doing physical and social distancing. So the act itself is probably not reducing our risk, but when you walk in there, there's a cognitive switch of, oh, yeah, hang on a second. We're not back to quote normal at this point. And I don't know how long that's going to be. I mean, I think we haven't really talked too much about variants, but the variants are concerning, especially as we move forward. It's coming from different communities where just vaccine uptake has not been really high. That's going to lead to more variants. And what we don't know is how effective our vaccines are going to be against variants 5 years from now, and what that's going to look like. So for me, doing the hygiene theater from a business standpoint makes sense because the TJ Maxx or the grocery store that you go to, they're showing, hey, this is important to us. Come shop here, right? Like you don't want there's like social media shaming of like, oh, no one's wearing masks, no one's cleaning things down. I just won't go back to that place. So they kind of have to meet what the expectations are, but also it's a cue of, when you're here, this is a serious thing right now. Let's not take our masks off. Let's not go back to quote normal. So I think there's a benefit to it, but it's not we're getting rid of the virus benefit.
Right. But like you said, maybe you're not going to get the flu or the common cold if that's happening. I mean, like I said, I haven't had anything. And we all know like, oh, where did I get the flu? Maybe at the mall, maybe at the grocery store. So maybe just for me, I always say I'm like Elaine on Seinfeld, who's a bit of a germ freak. So this is just fine and dandy for me. I'm doing just fine. Okay, a couple more questions from listeners. We have friends who we like to have group dinners with. We have been doing BYO food, bring your own food dinners for a year, and would love to get back to sharing. How much of a risk is it to have food made by others at a group dinner, a group gathering? Which I think we touched on already.
Yeah, but this is a fantastic question because I think there's another thing here. So for me, the food guy, the food's not an issue at all. Share the food all you want. Having a shared dinner with friends and group dinner, like group eating in shared air, that's the risk. The issue of, we've all talked about our pods and our bubbles over the last year. That bubble is only as good as the weakest link in the bubble. And I think about this in my personal life and settings. We have neighbors that like a year ago, the three families we all have kids that are the same age, and our kids have this social structure that they didn't have at school, but it became this like awkward conversation about like, okay, we're all taking this seriously, right? Like we're all not doing stuff that's going to bring a virus into the rest of our social group, right? And we've grown to know these people way more than we did beforehand because we had to have these awkward conversations, and even through vaccination, a whole bunch of different things. So to me, this question isn't really about the food at all. It's the risk is, what do you know about the people that you're sharing your food,
your
space, your space with,
yeah,
and that's the risk. And so as we get further into this pandemic and have more immunity from either acquired immunity from already having COVID or vaccines, that risk can go down, but that's the risk.
So maybe eat outside for now. And if your friends want to bring food, and then certainly when you're touching the handles and things like that, I mean, you can touch a handle and then wipe your nose. And that's certainly not good for getting the common cold. I don't know if that's not going to be a COVID thing or not. You said it's more from the air. So if I'm touching that handle, because we're all serving ourselves the pasta salad, and then I wipe my nose, is that going to be a problem for COVID?
So again, it's one of these things where like certainly theoretically could be, but so eating, I really like your suggestion, Liz, of eating outside, having lots of space, maybe bring your own utensil or scoop that you're going to go through, which has like other allergen problems that we have to control. But then also this, like, after, if we're going to use common utensils or, tongs, whatever it is, then we just go wash our hands or have hand sanitizer at the end of the line to manage that risk. That's the practical aspect of this, right? Like it's really easy for us to be like, don't do this. But I think as you highlight, it's also important to be like, well, if we are going to do it, what's the safe way to do this?
I hear your puppy in the background.
Yeah. So I think Amazon's here.
That would probably be a daily occurrence for most of us. Another question: are the new mutations able to spread more easily by contact instead of air? Will the new variants make it unsafe to get takeout?
So another really great question. I think we don't, the first part of the question, I don't think we know yet. I think this is the study, this epidemiology of the virus and looking at it. Do we see more over time? If we look back, will we see more contact related clusters or illnesses? The best guess is right now that no, we don't think that that's going to be the case based on what we know about these variants. They seem to certainly be more transmissible in aerosols, but that doesn't tell us much about what the variant that we haven't even discovered yet is going to look like 6 months from now. And so to the listener's question, I think that it's really important for us in the food world to keep asking the science about this, right? To keep investigating this. Like, I think that we want to make sure that where we are now, we're pretty comfortable that shared air is the issue. The variants that we might see in the next 8 months or 2 years, maybe it's something that we have to keep revisiting to be like, oh, you know what? This one really is transmitted more through contact surfaces. But all indications from the biology is that no, what we're encountering right now, it's not any different than what we've seen over the last 16 months.
Okay, here's a question from Jennifer, and this was totally my question. It would be great to mention the difference between eating outdoors versus indoors if dining out, and what the science says, if there is any. To Jennifer's question, once we're all vaccinated, will it be safer to eat indoors? Because like right now, I've had one vaccine and I've not had two. Like I am not eating indoors till I'm fully vaccinated, or will I ever eat indoors again? So let's talk about indoor versus outdoor. And should we invest in, like, which HVAC system do I need to buy stock in? Okay.
Right,
I need an inside tip here.
Yeah. So we mentioned before the FoodCoVNET website. We actually ran a webinar for the food industry about HVAC systems and aerosolization and indoor versus outdoor dining with some expert engineers who work in this area. And essentially, I'll boil it down to, outside air is safer because air exchange is 100%. The virus will, the aerosols move much quicker. They move away. Indoor dining, indoor settings, like looking around my room right now, my HVAC system's not built for air exchange to manage viruses. So I don't know in my little room here, how long, if I had COVID-19, how long it would persist. And restaurants, grocery stores, other settings where we have food, we also don't really know. It's site by site. Some places are going to have better airflow than others. Some indoor dining is going to have the ability to open up doors and windows that's going to allow for more air exchange. One thing that we've talked about a lot in the food settings as it relates to a restaurant is, for those of you who've been in the back of the house of a restaurant in a kitchen, there's hoods. Those hoods are turned on for a variety of reasons, but one is to draw odor and smoke and vapors out. So there's a negative air pressure pulling toward that hood. And we don't really know the impact of that. And so realistically, it's probably riskier if you're working under a hood than you would be if you're eating there because of the airflow and the dynamics. But that's kind of the area that our project's investigating right now. But we do know that outdoors, because of this air exchange and the virus and air particles want to spread around, it is a safer place. On vaccine, though, I think it's a really great question. And I want to I touch on this a little bit. What the vaccine does that we know about is it keeps us from getting symptoms and really sick. What we don't have a good handle on right now is whether getting vaccinated stops us from being able to transmit the virus. So what I mean is, if I am fully vaccinated, I may still be able to get infected. It may not result in any symptoms at all in me, but I could still transmit that virus to other people. And so from a public health standpoint, having a vaccine, just me personally, doesn't change my wearing a face covering, doesn't change the ability for me to be a carrier. So it all kind of depends on what your goal in eating out is. And from a vaccine, if it's, hey, I'm not going to get sick, cool. But if you're worried about the public health aspects of others, the jury's out on whether it's really going to stop the transmission of the virus. And that's not really what the clinical trials were built to measure. We'll know more about that as time goes on.
So once you have both of your vaccines, let's say right now you're eating, if you go out to eat once in a while, you live in North Carolina, it's warm, you're sitting outside. Once you have had both of your vaccines, will you eat inside at a restaurant?
So it's a great question. In fact, very timely. About an hour from now, I'm going to have my second vaccine. So yes, and this is an issue that I've provided a lot of support for folks in the restaurant industry over the last year. At the National Restaurant Association, my state level association, we run a program called Count on Me NC, which is a training program for restaurant employees and others in the service and hospitality industry, where we've had 16,000 people go through this program. And as part of it, I don't see all restaurants having the same risk. What I mean by that is, if a place has good training, if they're enforcing mask mandates, if they are really enforcing physical distancing in their setting, keeping people away from each other, opening the doors up, doing what they can, thinking about how this virus moves and the risks associated with that, keeping servers away, making sure that servers are wearing masks, all of that kind of stuff, I'm happy to go eat in a setting like that. But it's different that if I walk into any restaurant and they're not doing any of those things, I don't want to be there at all. And so the vaccine certainly helps give me a peace of mind of whether I'm likely to get sick from it, but it doesn't change my kind of, I've got, two kids that are 10 and 12, and they're not going to get vaccinated for quite some time. And I'm concerned about bringing virus back to them and transmitting it in the house. So I'm going to look, and I continue to look for, can I go eat outside? That's my number one choice. If I can't do that, then what are the practices that I see at that restaurant? And it's a continuum. There are high risk places to eat in Raleigh, and there are low risk places to eat in Raleigh. And I'm going to look for those low risk places where they're doing all of this, the CDC suggested, and the program that we developed, all of the practices that are there.
So from a consumer point of view, because we don't always have the luxury to go by the restaurant and scout it out, but can should we be shy, or should we just call the restaurant and say, what are you doing to mitigate the spread of COVID. And they might say, we're back to normal. Everyone's had a vaccine. It's all cool. Or they might go through and share those steps that you shared. And maybe that's more likely the place that someone who's concerned about this for their themselves or their family might be more apt to go to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your suggestion is exactly what I would want to do. And I think the pandemic is not a time for us to be shy or avoid awkward conversations because it's such a serious consequence. One thing that's been really nice, I don't know if you've noticed this, but both Yelp and Google reviews have been including what people are doing. I don't know how they get that information, if it's like sort of self-described.
Crowdsourced.
Yeah. So there's stuff out there on that. Again, I'll give a very North Carolina specific answer to this. For me, I'm looking for this like Count on Me NC certification designation at the door, which has like been super cool to see being part of that program, actually like seeing these like certificates that people are posting up. But at least it tells me they know what the right practices are. And then I walk in and I'll see, what does it look like? And if I'm not comfortable with it, then I won't eat there.
Are there other similar programs, Count on Me NC, like Count on Me MA from Massachusetts?
I don't know if if there's Count on Me MA, but there are certainly training and certification programs that other state restaurant associations and other industries are doing to really highlight. Like I've seen that even when I was in Tennessee last week, mountain biking, we would see like, oh yeah, public health, we've got a deep clean system. And it's important for us to have masks here, and then in other places it wasn't so much, and so we didn't go there.
Right, you know where to go or not to go. Okay, let's wrap it up soon because you need that vaccine. I just want to wrap it up with a question because I teased it at the beginning, just about the food industry. I mean, this could be a whole nother podcast on the food industry and resiliency. And gosh, are we going to go through toilet paper shortages and steak or beef or chicken or whatever it might be or fish, but because supply chains were so messed up early on. But early in the pandemic, we saw these news reports about meat packing plants and employees were getting sick. And it was just really troubling. Like, what the heck is going on there? And now I feel like the meat industry is like the gold standard. So what happened? What's happening in the meat industry that we can feel comfortable, not just the safety of our food, but the safety of those who are processing our food? These are hardworking people.
Yeah, there's a lot to this one. I think for me, one of the things that we have in all food manufacturing, food processing, whether it's meat packing or the place that you get your cut leafy green salad from, the system has never been built to have people physically in a distance from each other. And so just the way that our equipment, the efficiencies in that system that we've built, wasn't about like keeping respiratory diseases because we weren't dealing with a pandemic. And so to throw some of those risk reduction steps in the midst of it could really slow down our process. And I want to be real careful the way that I say that. It's not about like slowing down the inspection lines. It's that it could stop the supply of food, which is another big problem, right? Like we kind of have to balance all these things. So what I think the meat processing industry really dealt with was we in the food safety world talk a lot about how do you keep the product safe? What are the practices? What are the operating procedures that we have to make sure that we're not moving pathogens onto the food when you're here? In the midst of this outbreak or this pandemic, we had to get into, and I'd say my colleagues in the world of meat and poultry processing had to get into conversations about what is it that we're doing here when you're working? How are we going to change how you're taking your breaks, how we're socializing, what happens when you're not away from here, which is a very different conversation, which really led to clusters, right? Like being in close proximity around this process was really a transmission route, but someone bringing viruses in from the outside, it could run really rampant. And so I think a lot of things had happened. Face coverings were really early on in the meat and poultry processing plants, but we didn't have N95 respirators. The ones that we needed, there just wasn't enough in the supply. So now people were making sort of makeshift face coverings that may not have been as effective, trying to change the process of where people were standing and being around each other, all of that stuff. I think we learned a lot from the meat and poultry processing clusters early on that's been applied now in all these other food settings. I think that there's still, and we on our FoodCoVNET project, we have stakeholders from the meat and poultry world that are part of this. And I don't think we've solved everything. Like, I think how variants move through the setting is really going to matter. What vaccine hesitancy is going to look like and vaccine uptake is going to matter as we go forward. And these are challenges that I know our colleagues in that industry are really taking on a daily basis. But I think that the meat and poultry processing plants, there was a lot of coverage, but they weren't the only places where we had clusters. And so some of our other food industry folks were learning and still also managing this. And I think we're still we're gonna encounter this as we go forward as well. It's not, the pandemic is not over, and these clusters aren't going to magically disappear at the end of 2021.
So really what I just heard then is that you had these employees in these processing plants working physically closely. They were very efficient. We were getting food through. They were following food safety protocols. But now we have this coronavirus. Somebody could bring it in from the outside. They're all working closely together. It can spread. So, from what I saw during the conference you and I went to was that everybody has face coverings. They're wearing the shields. In many cases, they have gloves, they're sanitizing, they're distanced, like there's shields, the plastic between the employees. And so they had to really go in and change just the way the employees move and interact with each other, in addition to all those protocols just to keep the food safe. And now they have to keep the food and the people safe.
Yeah.
It's a tall order, but I was
Absolutely.
very impressed with the quick change that took place. And so you think just the food industry in general at large is really starting to practice all of these different preventative measures to keep their people safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was the food industry recognized really early on that they had to change something, because the consequence was having, a plan of 300 people working on whatever. You've got 260 people that are out for 2 weeks or longer with COVID-19. How do you run your business? So having that jump from place to place all throughout the country or the world is really a problem for our food supply system. So I think that the industry really took it upon itself to be like, we got to figure this out. And this is really for our project. A lot of the questions that we're trying to answer come directly from those industries, HVAC systems, forced air in a meat and poultry processing plant. It's important. We need to know about how do we manage that? What kind of filters do we need to put in place? We have a cold environment that's got a lot of moisture, because that's where what it looks like in a meat and poultry processing plant. So we've got to figure out, what do we do? And I've been very impressed and sort of proud to be part of that community, because the folks, the really progressive food safety folks, all of a sudden had to tackle a virus that we're not in the respiratory virus world. We worry about food microbiology, not airborne viruses. So we've got to learn about that and fix it, right? And actually come up with solutions. So again, it's been, certainly you can look back and say, oh, we probably could have done some different things or made different decisions. But in the evolving nature of the virus, I've been very, I guess, impressed with the ability of the community to address this and still, not look at it and be like, okay, we solved it, let's move back to the other issues. But every day we're still looking to make sure that we've got it right.
Right. And who knew that HVAC and airflow would be like the hottest topic, right? And I think in the restaurant industry in the year to come, it's going to be a huge talking point, because they have to figure out, if you're going to sit in this place, what's the airflow like? And they say that airplanes are safe because they're constantly recirculating the air. So that's a good thing, right?
Right. Well, and I mean, if you told me a year and a half ago that we'd be doing a project focused on a respiratory virus, and the first webinar that our stakeholders in the food industry wanted to know about first two webinars were HVAC systems and how do we talk about vaccine hesitancy. I mean, okay, what has happened? And now
Right.
here we are. And those are the things that, as a researcher, we're looking to connect the experts in those worlds to our food safety world and really trying to help solve these problems. But yeah, I mean, it's not something that we would have predicted.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation. I want to get you off to your vaccine. 30 seconds. Give me your final advice for my listeners when it comes to food safety and COVID-19.
So I think that we always have to think about the biggest risk in this pandemic is being around other people in shared air. And if I was to look at the 99.999% of clusters that we've seen over the last 16, 18 months, all throughout the world, that's what we know leads to illnesses and problems. And then the normal everyday food safety things that we in the food safety world have been recommending all the time about just, making sure that we're cleaning and sanitizing after food handling and keeping our hands clean and sanitized goes a really long way to reduce that risk even further. And so it's about being aware of our situations and thinking about how do we manage being away from other people not in that shared air, and then just doing those normal everyday, good measures.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Ben Chapman, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Liz. I appreciate you inviting me.
Okay. Wow. What a show. I learned so much. I hope you guys learned. We answered lots of questions. If you have any follow-up questions, you can always post a comment on the show notes from today's episode. Head on over to lizshealthytable.com/podcast. These show notes will be packed with great information for you. If you love the show, tell a friend about it, post a review on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, thanks for listening to Liz's Healthy Table.